Hi, I'm Julia,
I'm Brianna.
and we're going to be talking about jazz in the dungeon of the library.
Yes, we are in the dungeon of the library talking to you about jazz.
So, this topic, jazz, actually ties into To Kill a Mockingbird because they both, of course, have a lot of racism and hardships in them. Jazz was actually originally created by slaves because they didn't really have a lot of entertainment and they wanted something to use to rebel, and they wanted something to use to make them happy. So they would create this crazy music, and then white people were like, no, this is crazy, black people are bad, and it was completely racist. But eventually, then white people started stealing black people's music, and they would do what would be considered copyright, but they wouldn't give credit to anyone, and they would just completely steal everyone's they would just steal music, and it was awful, and it was really racist, and that's how it ties into To Kill a Mockingbird.
So people were really dependent on jazz in the 1920s because of the Great Depression, and also all of the men were being sent off to war. So some of the women started becoming flapper girls, and they would go into speakeasies, which are illegal clubs underground. And they were illegal because they were drinking, and apparently drinking was illegal back then for that time. Not just women were empowered by jazz. Mostly everyone during that era when it became really big were empowered by it, because it was just a type of music to express yourself, and it's just a way for everyone to be happy and have joy, and everyone to come together and forget that race was even in the picture.
Jazz was something that no one had ever seen before. It was crazy because it had all this new keys in it, it had all this improv, and it was kind of considered satanic for a point in time because the previous generations were super crazy and they were all Catholic, yeah. So one of the bands that was famously known in the 1920s-ish era was the original Dixieland Band. They made jazz music famous among white people, and they label themselves as the creators of jazz, which is completely not true because jazz had been around for hundreds of years, but they kind of just brought it to the light and they made it popular. They would use a rhythm called swing, and swing, for those of you who don't know, sounds kind of like this. And it was in a major tone, or they would be in bluesy tones, and it would really allow people to dance and to let loose and be free in a time where being free wasn't a thing.
Another person who influenced jazz, who was also black, was Duke Ellington. He was one of the most greatest and significant figures of jazz history in his generation. He made a pretty big impact on everyone with his music. His career started out in the 1920s as a band leader of a group with more than 10 people, and he later on went to make songs with his lead vocalist, Ivy Anderson. More of his songs that he did was It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got Swing. That was a pretty big song that he made. And then another one was Take the A Train, which was composed by Billy Strayhorn. While he was alive, he won 9 Grammys from the years 1959 to 1963, and then he won 3 after he died. He actually died in the year 1974, and he died from lung cancer at the age of 75. His last and final words were, "Music is how I live, why I live, and how I will be remembered." So many people attended his funeral, more than 12,000 people. He was buried in the Woodland Cemetery in the Bronx, New York City.
Duke Ellington was actually so famous in the 1920s when he was alive, and he's so famous today that he actually makes pretty large appearances in the modernized cartoon show Big Mouth, which is one of my personal favorites and one of her personal favorites. A lot of his songs that he wrote are also featured in Big Mouth.
Another influential person was Louis Armstrong. He was very, very big in his time. He actually sang the song What a Wonderful World, which is used in Madagascar. So before him, everyone was playing the style Dixieland, which came from the band Dixieland. It's improvisation where everyone played a solo at once. But shortly after that, Louis Armstrong came up that everyone would have their own solo. So like everyone had a spot in the lights.
So pretty much Louis Armstrong just turned jazz from one big cluster of randomness and solos to something that was actually like you could distinguish between different parts and you could tell like who's soloing, who's doing this, and it made jazz a lot better. So during the 1920s, when the rise of jazz was coming, because jazz wasn't popular and then it became popular and it was kind of cool, but so during the 1920s, that was also when the KKK started reemerging, and they targeted a lot of black musicians, and they targeted people specifically because they were black and specifically because they listened to jazz, and they would try to make jazz into this awful, awful, awful thing when it really wasn't. It was just a way to express yourself and a way to be free in a time where social ideals were kind of going crazy, you know?
So jazz actually originated in the US, which is actually how we started using the words cool and hip. Those were actually jazz terms. Another thing is that drum sets actually started because of jazz. Most jazz musicians would use them, which then in later years, people started using them more and more for other types of music. A good example of jazz is a song called A Second Line, which shows off a lot of components of jazz.
Also, jazz was pretty cool because it sparked the creation of a lot of different other music styles. Like, my favorite music genre is rock and roll, classical rock and roll at least, actually derived from jazz music because jazz had crazy techniques and they had crazy instruments and everyone was kind of just having fun, and that's kind of how rock started. And now for a performance with me in a couple of days because I'm actually sick right now and we're waiting on me to get better.